Let's be turning to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're going to be spending most of our time this morning in Psalm 11, but we're going to begin in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Good to have Joe back with us. He's had a good trip to Africa. Lots of good work was done, and we'll be hearing a report from him soon on that, I suspect, and we'll hear all about the work that was done, but we're glad to have him back, and I know Sandra is especially glad to have him back. I've been reading a book lately that's titled, What's Wrong with the World? You're kind of intrigued by the title, aren't you? This book speaks to the problems that we are facing in our society today. It is a book of social and political philosophy, a critical commentary on the social ills that plague our nation. And the author takes aim at four primary targets in his book. Large corporations that have more influence than they should. Large governments that have more power than they should. Feminism and education. Very timely topics, yes? Now, what's interesting about this book, though, is that it was written in 1910 by G.K. Chesterton, commenting on the situation in his country of England. Isn't it interesting how our social problems today are really no different than those of former times? But this should not surprise us, that people and countries have dealt with the same problems as those who have gone before. In fact, Solomon says that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 9, he says, "There is nothing new under the sun. Can anyone say about anything, 'Look, this is new'? It has already existed in the ages before us." But despite the fact that these problems have existed in earlier times, the fact is that the problems that we are facing in our world today, they may be new to us, but they are not new to the world. The problem is that we have forgotten, or we have neglected, or perhaps we are just ignorant of history. In verse 11, Solomon says, "There is no remembrance of those who came before." We forget. We neglect history. And just as we today have forgotten and neglected those who went before us, Solomon tells us that future generations will forget us too. There is no remembrance of those who came before, and of those who will come after, there will also be no remembrance by those who follow them. You and I, as righteous and godly people in this country today, we look around and we see things that are disturbing. We see things that are troubling. But we must understand that these are not new problems. In fact, it isn't just Solomon who says that these problems are actually ancient problems. His father David said the same thing. Let's go to Psalm 11. Put your marker there in Psalm 11 when you get there, because David pointed to the fact in Psalm 11 that his world was crumbling around him. In Psalm 11 and in verse 3, David says, "When the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Your translation might render it as a conditional. statement. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? But the point is the same. David looked around and he looked at the world in which he lived and he said, the foundations are crumbling. The foundations of our world, the foundations of our society, David says, they are crumbling all around. And I want to consider this morning that very thing. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? I'm staring at my clicker and my clicker is staring at me. There we go. All right. I was getting a bad signal, I think. If the foundations are destroyed, we don't know the situation that David found himself in. We don't know what was going on in David's life. There's been many people who have speculated as to where should we place this psalm and what was going on in his life. And the fact is we just don't know. Anything we offer would be speculation. But while we don't know what David was going through, we certainly know how he felt about it. And I believe we can empathize with David's words. So this morning, let's think about Psalm 11, and particularly verse 3. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? So let's start with this. I want to suggest to you, as David suggested about his situation in his time. All right, guys, can you advance me one slide, please? I am buying a new clicker. I'm tired of fighting with this thing. I want a clicker that will work from here to Charleston. And I'm going to find one somewhere. I know somebody makes it. All right, guys, go ahead and advance it one more time for me, please. Let's start with this. The foundations of our nation have been destroyed. And you might say, I think that's a little bit of a stretch. Maybe they're not completely destroyed. Can we all at least agree that they are in the process of being destroyed, if they are not completely there already? The foundations, this word that David uses here, it speaks to the underpinnings of a society. The things that are the pillars and the support. The foundations are the values of a people. Values of truth, goodness, beauty, justice, righteousness. It is on these values that the structure of a society is formed. The fabric of the society is knit together. These are the things that form the national character. Hit the slide for me one more time, please. You know this passage in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 34. All right, thank you. Proverbs 14 and verse 34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any nation. Sin is a reproach to any people, Solomon said in Proverbs. When these values are dismissed and they are replaced by wickedness, by unrighteousness, ungodliness, then shame is what comes upon the nation. David felt that everything around him was crumbling. In verse 2 of Psalm 11, he says, look, the wicked string their bows. They put their arrows on the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. He says the wicked are shooting at the righteous. They are putting their arrows on their bows, pulling those bows back, taking aim for God's people. Notice that they are shooting from the shadows, or in the darkness, or in secrecy. This is figurative language, by the way. I don't think David is saying that there are literal arrows that are being shot at him. He's speaking metaphorically here. The wicked are attacking the righteous. The wicked are attacking the principles of the righteous. And they're doing it in darkness. It's a concealed and a discreet effort in David's time. But the wicked are not always discreet, nor are their intentions always concealed. Turn to Ephesians chapter 5. Paul spoke of this. Ephesians chapter 5, he's giving a warning to God's people. And in Ephesians 5 and in verse 11, he says, "Do not participate in the fruitless works of darkness, but instead expose them." There are sins that are committed in the darkness. Paul says, don't go into the darkness and participate in the sins, but rather shed light on that darkness. Expose the sin that is within the darkness. Expose the sin that is in the secrets. And in verse 12, he says, because it is shameful even to mention what is done by them in secret. All of the sexually deviant sins which our society now openly promotes were once only done in places of hiding and darkness. But now we flaunt these things. We flaunt them in front of children, and we proclaim that this is good. Isaiah chapter 5 illustrates that this is not a new problem. In Isaiah chapter 5, people taking evil things and claiming that they are good, this is not new. Isaiah chapter 5 and in verse 20, Isaiah said, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." We all know the difference between bitter, semi-sweet chocolate and the good stuff. In my judgment, if a recipe calls for semi-sweet chocolate, it is a recipe that should not be prepared. Who wants bitter chocolate? Give me the real thing. Give me the sugar. That's what we want. And I'm making light of this, but Isaiah says we know the difference between bitter and sweet. You can't give me the bitter. Call it sweet. And tell me that I'm wrong for thinking it's not. Don't take something that is evil and call it good. And beloved, aren't we doing that in our nation today? There are so many things that can only be described as evil. And to our shame, we have powerful people who are proclaiming such things to be good. Beloved, it is a lie from the depths of hell. If God says something is evil, then it's evil. Our foundations have been crumbling in this country because they've been under attack for decades in this country. The principles of virtue, which at one time nearly everyone adhered to, those principles are not only neglected, but they are sneered at and ridiculed. Objective truth has been replaced by subjective feeling. This is so clearly seen in the Western world's obsession with the transgender ideology. Parents are told that they should affirm how their children feel on these matters. We have children's hospitals in this country who are performing surgeries on children. Integrity, hard work, and vows have been replaced by student debt cancellation and laziness. Objective notions of beauty, such as in arts and music, have been replaced with raunchy, explicit depictions of unlawful sexual gratification pursued at any cost. Humility and lowliness have been replaced by pride events that celebrate deviant sexual behavior. Pride, being perhaps the most egregious of all sins, has been exalted to the point of celebration of that which is most unnatural. Justice has been perverted in ways too numerous to count. Respect for traditional gender roles has been replaced by radical feminism. Keep in mind, beloved, this is very important, that all of these values that I had just mentioned, objective truth, integrity, hard work, beauty, humility, lowliness, justice, respect, those values come from God. Those are values of the book. Those are not values of the American Republican Party. They are values that may align with said party, but the Republican Party did not create those values. Are you with me? I am not up here stumping for political parties or people. What I am saying is that we have moved away from God's values. And if those values happen to align with one party or one person or candidate over another, so be it. But indeed, our foundations have been destroyed. So back to Psalm 11 and verse 3. David asks a question. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? What are our options when the very fabric of our society has been torn asunder? What can the righteous do when the supports and the pillars upon which our society has been built have crumbled? Well, let me start off by saying something that we cannot do. In Psalm 11 and verse 1, David says, "How can you say to me, escape to the mountains like a bird?" Whatever it is that's going on in David's life, he feels like society is crumbling around him. He feels like wicked people are trying to harm the righteous. But whatever it is that's going on, David has friends and advisors who are saying to him, run away. Fly to the mountains like a bird. Take your refuge in a place far from here. And David looks to his advisors and he says, how can you say that to me? How can you give me that advice? Flee to the mountains. How can you tell me to run away, to avoid the danger, or perhaps even just pretend that it does not exist? And beloved, we cannot do that either. We cannot run away from the fight. We cannot flee to the mountains like a bird, running away in fear, or acting like the foundations are not being destroyed, acting like everything is just fine. We cannot do that. But unfortunately, this is what many in our society have done. This is what many in our society have done, particularly among the powerful and influential. And certainly many of the movers and shakers of our nation have contributed to the crumbling of the foundations by taking their battering rams and forcing them into the walls of the foundation. Clearly, that has happened. But others among them while not assisting in the destruction, have also not resisted it. They've not stood up for these values. They have not stood in those foundations, fixing the breaches and rebuilding them. Our societal institutions have failed to uphold the virtues that all of us once upheld. And you listen to me and you say, well, that's not my fault. I'm not one of those powerful people. That's right. You're exactly right. It's not your fault. You and I are just insignificant people, aren't we? And for us insignificant people, it does no good to stand still pointing at the giant hole in the ship and blaming others who put it there without doing anything to try to fix it. To simply stand and point at the hole in the ship and all of the water that's pouring in as our ship is now sinking is not helpful. We all know the ship is sinking. The question is, what are we going to do about it? We can't flee to the mountains. So what can we do? Instead of taking our refuge in the mountains, the first thing we can do is take our refuge in the Lord. Did you notice that that's how David starts this psalm? I have taken refuge in the Lord. So don't tell me to seek refuge in the mountains. Don't tell me to run away. Don't tell me to go somewhere else. Because if I take my refuge in the Lord, then I don't need to go anywhere else. I don't need to run away. I don't need to be afraid. But what does that mean? To take refuge in the Lord. Well, let me suggest a couple of things. Number one, it means don't be afraid. If the foundations crumble, if everyone in this society turns away from God, I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to live in fear because I'm doing what God demands of me. I will not be fearful of social, political, cultural pressures from any source. God is with me. And he who is with me is stronger than those who are with them. Don't be afraid. So many of us in this country operate on the basis of fear. Isn't that what cancel culture is all about? Well, if I say something, if I speak up and I proclaim God's values, I might lose my job. If I stand up and I take a stand on the principles of what God's word says, then I might face some kind of fine or I might go to prison. And you know what the early saints say to us, beloved? They say, so what? Don't be afraid. God's people throughout history have suffered much worse than being canceled and losing their Facebook account. Don't be afraid. Secondly, it means stand up for what God has said. Stand up for what God has said. God's ways are still true and right. They will always be true and right. No matter what cultural changes take place, God's standards remain unchanged. God gives me a place to stand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rains came and the storms came and washed away the sand. And beloved, no matter where the sands of our culture shift or move, in the end, they wash out. but the wise man built his house upon a rock. God gives us a place to stand. He gives us these timeless principles of virtue and righteousness. He gives us the stable ground. And his judgment will come upon those who have destroyed the foundations. Look at verse 4 of Psalm 11. David says, "The Lord is in his holy temple." Holy place, I think, is probably the idea. Remember, the temple hasn't been built yet. The Lord is in his holy place. The Lord, his throne is in heaven. His eyes watch, his gaze examines everyone. The Lord examines the righteous, but he hates the wicked and those who love violence. Let him rain burning coals and sulfur on the wicked. Let a scorching wind be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds, and the upright will see his face. It is the wicked who are shooting their arrows at the upright from the darkness. But God says that the upright will behold his face. They will behold his glory, not from the darkness, but in the light of his goodness, in the light of his truth, his beauty, and in his wonderful presence. God is always on his throne, no matter who is in the White House, no matter who is in Congress or in control of Congress, no matter what happens on the world stage, God's throne stands. Do not be afraid. Stand with what he has said, and we're never in the wrong. So first, take refuge in the Lord. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Let me suggest something else. Secondly, we need to listen to those who have gone before. We need to listen to those who have gone before. In Psalm 78, this was our scripture reading this morning, and we're not going to read all of this again, but I want you to notice something that is said here. Psalm 78, Asaph is writing here, begging his people of Israel to hear the instruction that is coming from his lips. And I want you to know what he says in verse 2. He says, "I will declare wise sayings. I will speak mysteries from the past, things we have heard and known, and that our fathers have passed down to us." We need to listen to the earlier generation, he says. And when we do that, he says in verse 4, we will not hide them from their children, but will tell a future generation the praiseworthy acts of the Lord, his might, his wondrous works that he has performed. In verse 5, he says that he set up a law in Israel which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, so that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. They were to rise and tell their children, so that they would put their confidence in God. Listen to those who have gone before. The nation of Israel also, in addition to fathers and grandfathers and mothers and grandmothers, they also had elders. Older, wiser men of the nation who gave counsel to the people. Numerous passages speak of them and talk about how these men were guiding the nation. That if people in Israel needed help or needed wisdom, they would go to their elders. These men were the keepers of the flame, as it were. Where are such men today? An interesting, to say the least, thing has happened today. Have you noticed that youth seem to be the driving forces of so many cultural shifts that are taking place? Have you noticed that? It's not the 75-year-olds in America who are calling for gender transformations for children. It's a youth-driven movement. All of these movements that are taking place right now, so many of them are youth-driven. What's interesting about this is that God actually said something about this a long time ago. Go back to Isaiah chapter 3. This is a freebie. It's not on the screen. I just thought of it as I was sitting down in my seat this morning during our worship period. Isaiah chapter 3, there's an expression here that I think speaks to this very clearly. God is, in this chapter, pronouncing judgment upon the people of Judah for their wickedness, and he tells them about things that he will do to them in passing judgment. These are consequences that you will bear, okay? Notice what he lists among them. Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 4, God says, I will make children their leaders, and unstable rulers will govern them. The people will oppress one another, man against man, neighbor against neighbor. The young will act arrogantly toward the old, and the worthless toward the honorable. God says, you want to see how bad things can become? Wait till I put the kids in charge. Isn't that what's happened? Today, arrogant youths disrespect and disregard the ones who have gone before. The foundations are being destroyed by foolish children who think they know it all. And I will own up to this, and I will say primarily they are foolish children who are in my generation. Please don't let a majority of bad apples spoil those of us who don't think we are bad apples. I came across a quote last week that I think is very profound, written by a man named Donald Kingsbury, who was a mathematics professor who tried to write some books that frankly were not very good. But here's what he said. This is a short quote, but it's very powerful. I want you to listen carefully to this. Tradition is a set of solutions for which we have forgotten the problems. Throw away the solution and you get the problem back. Tradition is a set of solutions for which we have forgotten the problems. Tradition is perhaps one of the most evil words in our country today. And so we're trying to do away with historic tradition. And people have different reasons for wanting to do that, but we're trying to throw out tradition because if something is a tradition, that means it's old, and if it's old, that means it's bad. Mr. Kingsbury is onto something here when he says, no, actually, traditions become traditions for a reason. Those who have gone before us were faced with problems to which they needed to find solutions. And they found them. And when it worked, they said, hey, we should keep doing this. And the solution to the problem became the tradition. And as we are throwing away historical tradition in our country today, what we will find is ancient problems will rear their ugly heads again. Listen to those who have gone before. Third, when the foundations are crumbling, what can the righteous do? Fight back. And fight the battle on two fronts. Your family and your church. The culture does not have to infiltrate my family. I won't let it. Parents must refuse to let it in. We are the gatekeepers to the hearts and the minds of our children. We decide who or what comes in. No one else controls my family. No one else makes decisions for my family. So many of our social ills are directly connected to the breakdown of the family. But no matter what happens in the culture, we don't have to let it into our homes. The culture can do whatever it wants to do. It may try to force upon us whatever values it wants to force, but I can say no, and I must. We must still teach our children virtues. We must guide them into truth. We must show them the darkness of the world and the light that is found in the truth of God. Fight back in your family. Resist all of these things that the culture is thrusting upon your children. And secondly, the culture does not have to infiltrate the church. Paul said in 1 Timothy 3 in verse 15 that the church is to be the pillar and the foundation of the truth. The church is to hold up God's word before the culture and defend it as true and right. We hear a lot these days about this word woke. And we hear a lot about the woke church. We see numerous examples of religious institutions joining secularists in their foolishness. I had a funny conversation recently with someone about this very thing. Someone I'd met in the community. I don't remember the person's name. We were out in a public place. We struck up a conversation. The conversation shifted around. What do you do for a living? Well, I work at such and such a place. What do you do for a living? Well, I'm a minister at the Taylor's Church of Christ. Oh, you're a minister. And he went on to ask me, he said, is your church a woke church? I love questions like this. My answer was, no, we're not awake. We're very much asleep. We're almost dead, actually. These two institutions, family, church, work in unison to form the collective conscience of a people. These two institutions are creations of God, ordained by Him, instructed by Him, ordered and arranged by Him. And since that is so, He is the one who gets to make the rules. He has the authority over the family and how it is designed, what happens within the family, what should be taught within the family, and the roles within it. He makes the rules about the church, Christ's body, of which He is the head. He makes rules about the church and how it functions and what it teaches. Those things are determined by Him. They are not determined by governments. They are not determined by societies. It is true for family and the church. God's ordained institutions operate separately, outside of whatever political and social institutions may be the creations of men. Our foundations have crumbled. But let's not end this on a sad note. Because the fact is, beloved, G.K. Chesterton 112 years ago in England published a book saying, our foundations have crumbled. Little did he know that in just a few months, something called World War I would begin. A few more years down the road, the Great Depression. A few more years after that, World War II would strike. Do you think there were people who felt like the foundations were crumbling during those times? The foundations of God are in danger at all times, beloved. And just as Nehemiah led the nation in rebuilding the foundations of Jerusalem so many years ago, God's people must be rebuilding the foundations of this nation today. But let me tell you how it starts. It starts at the dinner table. one family at a time. We can vote all we want, and there may be good that comes from that. There have been some wonderful people who have been voted into public office, and they have served well, and they've done good things for our country. It's happened before, but it is not the majority of cases, is it? We want to change this country. Let's take care of our own first. Let's sit at the dinner table and let's talk. Let's put the phones down. Let's put the tablets away. Let's sit at the table. Let's talk about what's going on at school. Let's talk about what's going on the news and what we're hearing. Parents, it is our task to help our children understand this world. And we cannot understand it without this. I tried. I think I failed, but I tried to be more reserved and measured today. I tell you, and I'll be just totally honest with you, beloved. Things that I read, things that I hear that are going on in this country, they frighten me. They frighten me. But I don't have to be afraid. I refuse to be afraid. Because I'm going to take my stand upon the foundations that God has put into place. If they crumble in society, they don't have to crumble in my home. If they crumble in our culture, they don't have to crumble in this church. We're going to stand for what is true and what is right. Thank you for your attention this morning. Take courage, beloved. The battle belongs to the Lord. That's what we sing. Let's sing it as we mean it. And Alan's thinking, oh, that's not my invitation song. I know that. That's not in my outline. I'm just speaking off the cuff here. I love you all so much. You encourage me. You lift me up. You make me want to keep going. I hope maybe today's lesson has done that for you. Don't give up. Dig in. Get stronger. Let's work together. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, we want you to become one. More than anything, we want you to become one. And you can come to Christ, find forgiveness, find hope, and begin living in truth and confidence. That's what we want for you. If we can help you this morning, we invite you. Please